Hello, and welcome again to the Executive Room podcast, where we delve deep into the minds of remarkable executives who have shaped the business world with their ideas and actions. I'm your host, Kimberly Afonso, CEO and founder of the KA Consulting Group, where we are experts in CEO visibility, and today it's an honor to have Noah Landow join us. Noah is the founder and CEO of Macktez, a technology consulting firm that brings together creativity and technical rigor to tackle complex challenges. With deep experience in architecture, interactive and print design, network infrastructure, and database systems, he leads cross-disciplinary teams with clarity and vision. He serves as board president of Union Docs and is also a fourth-degree black belt in Aikijujutsu, a form of martial arts. This unique blend of leadership and discipline brings both artistry and purpose to the projects he takes on. So great to have you here, Noah.
Great to be here.
And I see your great office that I was very happy to see in person behind you. That could be another story for another episode for our listeners about your architecture background, which we'll start a little bit about now. So you founded Macktez in 1996, following some work in architecture, interactive, and print design. Could you share more about your journey? Why did you transition to, where you are now and founding your own company? And how have you integrated your previous backgrounds into the work you do today?
It's a great question. So a couple of different aspects to that. First and foremost, I guess when I was in school, I did architecture, but I had been particularly interested in graphic design. I had done that as my sort of like summer job for a number of years. And my first job out of school was actually for a German design firm called Meta Design in San Francisco. And I spent the entire summer, it ended up being 5 months because the project just kept going, working with an amazing group of people. But I spent most of my time working with the Hewlett-Packard test and measurement engineers who are on the client side, and very little of my time actually working with my fellow designers and creatives. And so I got to New York and as a favor for a friend, actually one of my thesis advisors, started doing some technology work and kind of looked around and said, wait, if I do this, then the people I'm working with will be all the creatives who I enjoy working with, as opposed to when I was doing work as a creative, all of my time was spent dealing with these sort of engineering folks from Hewlett-Packard. And I was like, I think I enjoy this a lot more, just working in the design creative and doing technological things for that group versus the inverse. So that was the sort of like origin story. New York also had a lot of opportunities, so those just kind of kept flowing. New York's an amazing place for sort of connecting to people and having kind of relationships and opportunities sort of spawn other opportunities. And so a group of friends and I got together and started sort of Macktez as a consultancy that in the 90s was sort of what IT and technology kind of meant was rather different. A lot of things didn't really work. That was my first job involved trying to set up a mail server for a company that had never had a mail server before. This was before there was like Google or Gmail or anything. And so it was sort of an entertaining and a fun time to explore all these sort of new things, but the endless world of sort of all these sort of technological opportunities and systems and sort of like things like replacing fax machines with email, which at the time seemed kind of innovative, now seems quaint. But
That must have been a really, really cool time to start. And you've been in the business for so long, since '96. So congrats. And what are some of the like huge changes that you've seen to what you've been doing to doing now? And what are some of the changes that really excite you of where we're going next?
There are a lot of changes, cherry picking so that I don't spend the next 45 minutes making long lists. I think one of the things I think about a lot, this comes up, it's actually a section in the book that I'm working on with my business partner, is this idea of consumerification, which of course is not a word we've made up, but in the context of IT, it's the idea that many of your kind of staff and the people that you're interacting with in this sort of technological landscape have a set of expectations from using tools as a consumer. They expect them to be user-friendly. They expect them to look good. They expect them to work well, which is very much at odds with how a lot of enterprise and business tools worked 20 or 30 years ago. Nowadays, the idea that you would have like an iPhone that you would pick up and it would kind of work for personal stuff as well as work, that was not the case 20, 30 years ago. So there's I think a trend line in general where people expect the technology to work much, much better. And that's obviously from an individual level, but from an organizational perspective, that also means that a lot of organizations, particularly smaller organizations, don't require the kinds of technological support that they would have a quarter century ago. So many people now, and by that I mean maybe the majority of people who are starting a small business, can do so with just a credit card, go to a website, type in a Google Workspace or a Microsoft account and set up a Dialpad account and, set up a Xero account for QuickBooks and all these different services and systems that require really only kind of typing in some basic information and then getting started. Now, many of those things do get more complicated as organizations scale, and that's a big part of what we do is work with organizations that were like, oh, this is going to be fine, I'll just do it myself, and then kind of look around, a year or two later at 50 or 150 people and say, wait, things are kind of falling apart a little bit. Maybe we need to think about this a little differently. And that's exciting. Those are fun problems to solve. But I think that consumerification, that tendency for products to become, cloud and SaaS and sort of packetized and quality interfaces, that entire trending is it's such a very interesting space, particularly compared to what even 5 or 10 years ago, many of these products were much less polished. So I think it's exciting to see, people equipped to kind of like hop in and get to work on some of these things in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have. I think it also encourages some really interesting experimentation. People will try something and then try something else, and you kind of reward the idea that actually trying it is a value, not just sort of talking about trying it or conceptualizing the idea that you might try it someday, but actually like experiment.
Wow, would have never thought about that, but it makes a lot of sense with, where we're going and wanting to have things that work the same way. So it makes a lot of sense. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Noah, on automation. So you've been hosting some conversations on it. What are you seeing as near-term wins from automation, and what pitfalls do you see? So you mentioned you work with a lot of organizations who hit a certain mark and then, they call you in for support. So what are some of the pitfalls mid-market or mid-sized organizations hit when they try to scale, and, how can they use automation more efficiently?
It's a complicated answer. It's complicated in part because the landscape of what we mean by automation is sort of constantly changing. If we talked about automation maybe 5 years ago, I think most small scale kind of ideas would have been things like Zapier, the idea that you have some tool that connects to a bunch of other tools, you can kind of queue things up, or N8N or any of these other kind of visualization workflow tools. But I think now a lot of times when we talk about automation, we're talking about kind of like AI optimized or enhanced or augmented kind of tools. And there's some very interesting things happening in that space. I think it's sort of too soon to say where some of those lines are going to end up. In other words, the rate of change is sort of a little bit eye-watering. There's also an enormous amount of sort of hype and kind of exuberance in that space, a lot of which doesn't necessarily, and maybe some of which doesn't at all, translate into actual like real useful things. So sort of disentangling a little bit how much of these things are like actually really going to work and how much of them kind of work in a prototype but then don't work once you get past that. But there's a lot of very interesting things happening where products, and by products I mean like software services that are designed like a product, have built-in kind of AI automation tools that expand or enhance the capability of those systems. There are also many like ChatGPT and Gemini and all these kind of other systems that exist outside, but I think a lot of the most interesting things are actually happening in these kind of AI tools or machine learning tools that are embedded within other services. Partially it's because they tend to be a little more actually functional. In other words, they tend to be designed to do something that the producer of that software tool actually has gotten requests to do, so that the thing it does is actually solving a problem that's here, not a theoretical one, but an actual one. And I think also one of the great conundrums of a lot of automation is sort of how do you protect access to data effectively, while at the same time granting access to it to the necessary tools and people that need to access it. That's the sort of like whole security modality, which is sort of at the center of a lot of IT now.
Wow. So there is really a lot. I would have never thought about that. Thank you for sharing that with us and the audience, especially about the tools that you're seeing that are embedded in others. I mean, that makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. So I'd love if you could share a little bit more. Are there any exciting projects you're working on in your company, or things you're learning in your company that could be relevant or useful to our listeners who are, mostly CEOs and other founders and always looking to expand their knowledge?
So I should mention that I'm always tempted, and in private, I would mention a bunch of company names we work with, but we tend to be a little delicate about sharing the names of the companies we're doing some of these projects for. Typically, I won't mention the name unless they have kind of approved a case study that mentions their name on our website. So that's our sort of like, sometimes that takes 6 months of back and forth legal things. So I'm going to stick to, if I mention a company name, it'll be one that actually has a case study. So if anyone's curious, you can get more information about that. But those do tend to be projects that are a little on the older side. The ones we're working on right now, of course, don't have case studies up yet. But we do have a couple of very interesting kind of automation integration projects for companies, and I can mention the software tools that we use that use a identity platform called JumpCloud, which is a great product that we use a lot. It's not the only identity kind of management platform that we use, but it is one of our favorite. We have a great relationship with them. My business partner, Michael, even appears last year, went out to their annual retreat and was one of the speakers. So they're a really great product that combines a lot of really useful tools in a very kind of elegant and clever way. And they solve a bunch of problems, particularly in kind of cloud-based and multi-platform environments, which kind of describes a lot of the clients we work with. And one of the things that's most interesting about JumpCloud and this kind of tool set is that there's some very interesting functionality coming in that allows you to connect it to things like HR systems. So some of the projects we're working on are either connecting it to HR systems or connecting it to ticketing systems so that more and more of the onboarding and offboarding processes can be triggered and initiated by the HR teams or the people experience teams, which cuts out the sort of like game of telephone that sometimes happens, when we have clients which onboard 80 people in a month, and there's a lot of room for small mistakes to be made, and also just a lot of labor. So automating some of that is an area where using these built-in kind of sort of polished functionality, and then figuring out how to connect those to another system. There's a few different ways that can happen, and we have a couple of different experiments that are solving that in different ways. But I'm excited to see that proceed. That potentially could save many tens of hours in any given week for some of the team.
Oh, wow. And I'd love now, Noah, to speak a little bit more about some of the personal things that you are doing, investing your time in. You're a super interesting person, so I'm really excited for the audience to hear more. And let's start with creative community. So it's clear creative community is really important to you. You do a summer stipend at your company. You're also board president at Union Docs. Tell us a little bit more about these projects, and in what ways do they express the values that really drive you and your company?
That's great. I should sadly note that we don't do the summer stipend anymore, although we did for more than a decade, I think 12 years. But that was one of those projects that we pulled back a little bit during COVID, and that was not one of the things that made it back. We do have a Tête-à-Tech, which is our Tech Talk series, which is sort of like our current place that we put some of those creative energies. But Union Docs, which I first met because they were one of our early stipend recipients, so that's a good segue. Union Docs is a really interesting, really impressive documentary arts organization that is based in Queens. I am the board president. I've been involved for a decade and a half now. And one of our big projects over the last few years has been buying a building, renovating it. Union Docs is unusual in that it is, I think, currently the only kind of documentary film organization that also has a residency. In other words, the top 2 floors of the building are residential. And so people come and and actually participate in a bunch of collaborative filmmaking projects. And those are, a mixture of people who live in the building and people who are kind of commuting in. I think that creates some very interesting opportunities. It's also very interesting from an international travel perspective. Similarly, Union Docs is very interesting in that it's not just documentary film, it's documentary art. So they also do podcasting and photography. And they did, up until a few years ago, have this amazing live action documentary project called Say Something Bunny that you should take a look into. If you haven't, if it was still going, I would absolutely enthusiastically send people there. It was fantastic. It sold out every night. It was really wonderful. But this idea of sort of documentary nonfiction being something that isn't constrained just to film, I think is an important part of the organization.
Amazing. And tell us a little bit about Tête-à-Tech, your talks as well.
Sure. So the Tête-à-Tech, and I have to give credit to the team for that. Yeah, Tête-à-Tech. I'm not sure my French pronunciation is doing that any sort of justice. So don't take that as a correction from me. Tête-à-Tech is sort of kind of like a fireside chat format. It's in person. As you charmingly noted at the beginning of the call, we have a lovely office in the East Village on 11th Street, right near Tompkins Square Park and right near the L train. And we've been there. It's coming up. It'll be 3 years in January. And we, a couple of years ago, kind of looked around and felt like we weren't taking advantage of how lovely the space was enough, and added at the time it was once every other month. We're actually more frequently now. I think we have 3 or 4 this month, so there's actually quite a bit more activity this quarter. But those are essentially fireside conversations where I jokingly say I find somebody that is an expert in something, and then I trap them in a corner at a party, and for 45 minutes pestering them with questions. So I just do that in front of everybody else. It's a great opportunity for us to talk about some really kind of like weird and quirky and interesting topics, but it's also a chance to connect some of those to technology and ideas of technology and roles of technology in society. So we also have some of those are more directly applied to the work that we do. One of our recent ones was on infrastructure as a service, of which JumpCloud, the company I mentioned earlier, featured quite prominently, and we were joined by a couple of people from JumpCloud. So sometimes questions would come up and we could turn to one of the co-founders and say, how does this work? And that's always fascinating. Those are also quite small. We keep those to around 25 people max, usually 20, 25 people. So it's small enough that it's sort of more like a dinner party than it is like a talk or a lecture. And the format is sort of one very long table. And that table means that sort of 2 of us talk. I talk to somebody directly kind of across in the center, but the acoustics of our space are such that it's quite easy to hear. That also means we can do things like splinter off at the end, and little clusters of people tend to stick around for another hour or so after the talks and kind of ask questions and further sort of dip their toes into some of the topics. So we have some fantastic topics coming up. We had some fantastic ones over the last couple of years. We have one in January on telehealth and hormones with a really interesting biotech startup. We have one coming up in a couple of weeks called the neuroscience of aesthetics. So some of them are like very interesting science things. We actually have a sort of a Tête-à-Tech adjacent talk that's not super technical, but that's sort of a bit of a more of a discussion topic the day after tomorrow called After Architecture. I'm doing that with the head of architecture at MIT, who's coming down for the night. And we're doing kind of a relatively small 20 some odd person group where we're just going to talk about what does it mean to have explored a career which is not architecture after doing some sort of education in architecture. So looking forward to that conversation just in a couple of days.
Well, really, really cool topics. And I don't know how you come up with them. I'd love to hear how, because they are so, diverse too. Is it just like something, you've met someone and something comes into your mind that you could talk with them about, or is it more planned out?
That's great. My process, not that anything terribly exotic or secretive here, but my process is when I encounter somebody who I think, ooh, that person would be, if only I could catch that person at a dinner party and kind of pester them for 45 minutes. That's jokingly, but kind of my thought process. So I'll think, I wonder if blah, blah, blah would be willing to do a talk. And so when I encounter people, I tend to reach out. And I have to say about half the people I've reached out to have been like, yeah, let's do it. Sometimes people I'm surprised by. And then there's a little bit of a process there where sometimes I want to find a topic, if I can, that's adjacent to what they most usually talk about. One of our tech talks, for example, recently was with an author who's very outspoken in the sort of LGBTQ, trans. She's a journalist, like a really interesting person, but tends to speak on these social issues, but also happens to be albino. And so I was like, I actually want to do a tech talk on albinism. Like, what is like the actual experience of albinism, not these other topics. And she was like, yeah, I'm happy. I'd never talk about that. I'm happy to. So sometimes we find something that's sort of like 1 degree removed from the topics that these people are used to speaking about. That's also fun and interesting.
That's really cool. And I've never met any business founder or anyone who has done something similar. Would you recommend this format, or what can other, CEOs or founders take from your format for inspiration to maybe do their own sort of thing?
That's an interesting question. I think there's my theory on motivation and leadership is that it's really important to care about the things you're doing. And that most of the time, the limiting factor for most people, particularly in a leadership position, I find is not time, but kind of like engagement, investment, emotion, and caring. So it's really like the attention is the limiting factor. And it's much, much easier to spend 8 hours doing something that you're excited about and impassioned by. And it's really hard to spend 8 hours doing something that feels like a drag. So, and I think all of us have had that experience where you kind of get a flow and you're like, oh, 6 hours later you look up and you're like, I'm still doing this thing. This is like, I want to finish it. I'm having fun. And so I try to use that kind of perspective as a bit of a guiding principle. I think if there's topics that somebody is super excited about and they get kind of thrilled at the prospect of talking about, then that's a great opportunity to talk. But I wouldn't encourage somebody to do this sort of who didn't have that kind of enthusiasm. For me, I find kind of this interview process to be really fun, and it's something that I kind of gives me energy and I find entertaining. And also it's an opportunity both to grab friends, because many of the people who have been Tête-à-Tech speakers are people I know socially or through friends of friends. So sometimes it's an opportunity to like connect with somebody who I want to spend time with, and it gives me an excuse to spend time with them. And sometimes it's a chance to get to know somebody new who I didn't know beforehand, but now I would consider a friend. So if those are things that are motivating and are fun, then the sort of low-hanging fruit is like, you just have to get them to show up for a couple of hours. They just have to be in New York. I do happen to really like in-person events. It's something that I just find the quality and the nature of the connection that you have when you all are gathered in a room is just wonderful. You and I met recently in person, and I do find that is not always the most practical. Certainly, it would be much easier to do this talk series as a web or as a Riverside or even as a podcast. So every few months we do re-examine of like, maybe we should do it this other way. But at least for now, I think it still sits in a space where it's sufficiently gratifying and we fill up that I think it's still worthwhile. But we might add a sort of webinar version of it at some point in the future.
Oh, very cool. And I think that's great advice. I agree on anything that any leader does, whether it's, starting a podcast, starting an in-person talk, have to be, passionate about it and interested, because then it'll be really good. And you can totally see your passion for it, which makes it really, really cool. And so I'd love to go, that was talking a little bit about your leadership style, but I'd love to hear more about that. So you've been, in the industry for decades. You've seen the evolution of technology, creative industries. What advice would you give to the next generation of leaders and entrepreneurs from, what you've seen as a leader?
I think a lot of leadership is, it's easier to look back afterwards and be like, ooh, that worked well. I think it's very tempting. There's a little bit of a cult of heroes and kind of genius, particularly in American business, which I don't really subscribe to. I really think is a little bit of a sort of a retroactive fantasy. A lot of times we look at people that are successful and say they're successful because they're super smart. but many people who were equally smart weren't as successful. So I do think there's an important element to recognizing what a big factor luck and sort of circumstances. And, I'm lucky to have met the business partner who is my business partner, 25 years ago. And I'm lucky that the, .com 1.0 business that he started, he decided to wind down during that before the bust. And then he joined as a business partner. So, there are many moments, I think, in kind of like leadership and business where I remember many years ago talking to a friend who felt like he was very depressed and frustrated because his business had hit sort of a hard spot. And his partner explained, well, part of the problem is that he felt like he was a genius when it was doing really well, but that also means he's an idiot when it's not doing well. And I think that's something that a big part of leadership is sort of maintaining a little bit of separation and kind of recognizing that luck and circumstances play an enormous role in how successful we are in our businesses. But there is absolutely a component where, as a leader, but also as any member of a team, you need to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves, and you need to be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities before they arise. So not letting yourself get too wound down and too tired and ground by lack of success, but also recognizing that you still have to do all the work to be ready for when those opportunities fall in your lap, that you can take full advantage of them and do the best you can with them. So that's sort of one. I guess the other would also be it's very important, I think, if you're a leader, to trust your team. And that's not always easy. I think delegation and management, and there's a lot of skills to learn, remembering to keep your mouth shut and stop talking sometimes, and, when to sort of ask people questions versus telling them to do things. Those are all lessons that I feel like I could do much better, and I'm still trying to do better. But I think a big part of successfully leading ultimately is choosing the right people to sort of be part of your team, to lead with you, and to lead by example. And a big part of that, I think, is just sort of continuously trying to do better. No matter how you're doing, there's always things you could do better on, and kind of look for those opportunities. Try to be humble about the fact that there's still lots to do better next time.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and I think that's always inspiring to see other people see that when you're the leader and you do have that attitude. I think that is really, really inspiring. And what values and core principles have you relied on the most in your company?
Trust. It's actually when we talk internally, whenever we do a leadership briefing, which we did one this morning. One of the final slides is always talking about trust, some concept of trust. I think all businesses arguably require some degree of trust, but because of the work that we do, the industry we're in, trust is really like an absolutely central component. We need our clients to trust that we're going to be competent, to trust that we're going to be ethical, to do the right thing when things don't work or become a problem, or something breaks, or a vendor produces a product that doesn't solve the problem the way we all thought it would. It's important that they trust that we're going to be there with them to sort of navigate that path together. So I think trust is being trustworthy, being providing assurances, being reliable, competent, of course, is also a component of that. But really, I think the trustfulness and trustworthiness is one of the central components that if I were going to pick one central thing, I think that's our kind of core.
That's a great one. And I'd love now to talk a little bit about the book you are working on with your business partner, Tame the Tech Beast, which explores the complexities of scaling technology businesses. What inspired you to write it? Who should read it? And what else can you share with us from the book?
Awesome. I love talking about this. I obviously spent a lot of time thinking about it. I think we're very close to finishing. I might be overly optimistic. I think we're on our 7th revision, or maybe it's 8th. Both my business partner and I are a little bit of perfectionists, so we're trying to reach a point here of when is it good enough to say that's good enough? We're not quite there yet, but close. Tame the Tech Beast is sort of a slightly whimsical and lighthearted way to talk about this idea that many organizations, it's certainly one of the things that we look for in clients and the kind of organizations that we work with best, best, are confronted by some sort of technical challenge. It's often like a mess or a tangle or a debt or something that sort of presents them with a series of challenges that are a bit too much for their in-house teams to handle. So most of our clients, not all, we have some clients we deal with where we act like the entire IT and tech departments, but many of our clients, the vast majority of our clients, we work with somebody internally. Sometimes it's a CTO and a staff of 24 people. Sometimes it's a single person. Sometimes it's a receptionist who's handling kind of like, front end user support. So the scale of the organization and the type of organization affects who we're working with internally. But very often we're talking to people who are very competent and capable and can do a lot of these things themselves, but they either don't have the resources or the manpower or the particular subject matter expertise to solve some subset of the problems. So a lot of times what we're talking about when we first start talking to clients, we often have this sort of like, oh, I wish we could have had this conversation a year ago. It's a bit of a joke internally that the book was inspired by, well, how would we have that conversation a year before we have the prospective conversation? And a book, of course, was the sort of the answer that wound its way through our discussions. The idea, if you could get that book into their hands a year before, then maybe they would pause and not make some of the missteps that they make, some organizations make before we get a chance to work with them. And how awesome would it be to be able to work with an organization that kind of was coming to you at exactly the right time, right when they're ready to make some of these configuration changes and adopt some of these new technologies and new tools. So in practical terms, a lot of our clients are organizations that have some sort of legacy. An example would be maybe a legacy identity system like Azure or Active Directory that sort of didn't get updated because everybody in the company is busy doing their actual jobs. And the idea of like ripping out this really major kind of complicated central component and modernizing it is just really daunting for everyone involved. And so we often get involved to start having conversations about how would that work. There's all these benefits you could get from that, but like who has the time when your kind of like tickets queue is already full and your list of projects is already a little daunting and people are telling you should be doing AI projects. It's like, how are you going to deal with this sort of kind of unexciting fundamentals? And so we often get involved to augment the staff, help give them a little headspace and work with them both to sort of make those transitions happen and sort of do the project management and technical tool sort of integration to sort of weave all those different webs together. So those are exciting and fun projects, but Tame the Tech Beast was sort of our way to talk to CTOs, particularly product, meaning CTOs that are focused sort of on the product of the company, not on the internal technology, and also to CEOs and COOs, CFOs. Sometimes we also work with CISOs, which are chief sort of security officers or information security officers, and those different kind of executives often have mandates to solve these problems, but often don't have the kind of the right team members or enough team members to sort of like actually do that themselves. So we can work with some of these high level entities and organizations in order to step in with a team of 6 or 7 people and kind of solve something in a year or two that might have taken 5 years to solve on their own.
Oh, wow. And I know you said you're on one of your hopefully last revisions. Do you have a potential launch date that we could look out for the book?
I think we're aiming for by December. I would have said 2 months ago, November, but I feel like I'm trying to be realistic with the holidays. But yeah, aiming for the end of the year, certainly, hopefully December.
Okay, great. So that could be a great holiday present for any listener who, fits that bill, CEO, CTO, CSO, or curious to learn more. So we will link that as soon as it is available too, and I look forward to seeing it as well. And
Wonderful.
I'd love to speak a little bit more about visibility. As you know, Noah, this podcast always focuses on visibility for CEOs, and you are actively engaged in public speaking, media, podcasts. You're having your book come out, which is a huge visibility marker. You have your LinkedIn. So what impact has all of the things you do related to your CEO visibility had on your company? And what advice would you share with other CEOs who are still hesitant to put themselves out there?
I think it's important that I think this is said a lot, but I think it's important to be authentic. I would half jokingly, half seriously say it's sort of important to be yourself when you're out in the world, partially because it's kind of exhausting and stressful to try to be someone else. But that having been said, the things that are exciting and the things that motivate you, if there are some of those that are connected to public talking, speaking to groups, engaging with events, kind of look for opportunities to practice. I do see a lot of these conversations like the one you and I are having right now in this sort of lens of like, these are opportunities to practice talking about some of these things I get excited about, but the more you talk about them, I think the more kind of familiar and comfortable and polished the kind of the narratives go. And I think a big part of being a leader, particularly a CEO, is sort of communicating succinctly and effectively and clearly, like why and like why are we doing this thing? And so I think it's really important to sort of practice having those conversations, not just with your own internal team, but also with the outside world. I think it gives you a chance to say, like, why does my company exist? Like, why are we here at all? And so these kind of conversations, I think, are wonderful opportunities to both practice that and also sometimes to get challenged. In these conversations, sometimes people will be like, well, what about this? Or what about that? And I think it's great to hear those outside perspectives and give you a reason to sort of ruminate and think and mull over, like, that's a good question. Why do I think that? What would my response to that sort of interrogation be?
Oh, great way of looking at it. And lastly, I have to ask you a few questions about, tell us how to say what you have your 4th degree black belt in. Please say the full name you said before. So tell us a little bit more about that. What drew you to that type of martial art, and what do you enjoy most about it? And lastly, how has it influenced your leadership? Because I'm sure it has in some way.
Sure. I studied a different martial art when I was younger. I actually studied Shotokan karate when I was in high school for 5 years. And actually, in a funny little factoid, I studied that with my parents, and they continued training a little bit longer after I left for college. And then after taking a break for, I think, 20 years, restarted. My mother in her 80s still does it, which is sort of amazing. Wow. She has like a private session with the martial arts teacher once every week or two. So kudos to her for that. During college, I'd sort of switched and ended up, not doing that training for many, many years. And then when I moved to New York, I frankly at a dinner party ran into a remarkable individual named Rodrigo Kong, who is, among other things, an ER doctor, runs the Sim Lab at one of the Northwell hospitals. But also when I met him, he had just finished a master's degree in figurative sculpture. So he was a traditional figurative sculptor who did like actual anatomically accurate sculpture. He also worked as a personal trainer and a self-defense coach for a while. Really amazing individual. But he and I had a fantastic conversation at a dinner party in the East Village, actually not far from where our office is. And he started teaching. At the time, he was teaching a different style of Filipino family martial art called Tama, Kempo, and trained with him for a number of years. And there's a longer, more complicated answer, but the short version of this is he encountered a very extremely well-respected but slightly unusual and esoteric martial artist from Japan at a training seminar, was extremely impressed with their sort of martial skill and became fascinated by the history and the story behind it, and ended up switching the entire dojo from this sort of Filipino family style to this Japanese traditional koryu. We actually just celebrated our 25th anniversary of that organization a few weeks ago, in August, I think it was, maybe a month or two ago now. But so yeah, we had our 25th anniversary and had people from Japan and Seattle and France and a bunch of other countries came in. We did a public demonstration at Mark Morris Dance Center, which is across the street from BAM in downtown Brooklyn. But a big part of that martial arts training is really about this is obviously pulling one piece out that I think is more relevant here than some of the others. A big part of it is about not allowing your kind of like emotional and body reaction to be dictated by the other person. A big part of this kind of martial art is essentially resetting and intentionally controlling kind of like the level of stimulation and excitement so that when somebody is attacking you, you are relaxed and you are focused and you are calm, not freaked out and scared. Obviously harder to do at the beginning, but with practice it becomes easier. And a big part of controlling the situation is sort of being kind of mindful of what's happening kind of in the early stages, not predicting the future, but doing things that put yourself in a position to succeed. So I think there's some wonderful metaphors in that. I'm actually working on a second book with Rodrigo, specifically called The Anatomy and Physiology of Daitoryo, which is one of the words that you asked me to repeat. The full name of the style we study is Daitoryo Aikijujutsu. But for people who aren't in the martial arts world, this is the martial art that Aikido comes from. So it's often called pre-war Aikido because it's the person who invented Aikido trained this for 20 or 30 years before inventing Aikido. So it has some quirks to it that are very interesting, but very interesting style, some really interesting lessons. And hopefully once I finish this current book with Macktez called Tame the Tech Beast, the next one coming up, I'm hopefully not more than a year or so later, will be this series of conversations from Rodrigo about anatomy and physiology of this esoteric Japanese martial art. Super interesting topic.
Very, very interesting, and glad to hear about both of the books that we can look forward to. Very different, and I think that's what's really cool. You have a ton of interest, Noah, as a business leader. That was really inspiring to hear about today. Thank you so much for sharing with us, and until next time.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here, Kimberly.